Say two things at the outset here. One is that, and it feels a bit austere for Florence, but I'm afraid I have no visual aids for this talk. But in compensation, I wore this bright yellow tie, so if the words don't captivate you, maybe the bright yellow will. And then secondly, on the back of Edward's talk, I'm afraid there are no decapitations in this paper either, but at least not of persons, as I recall. So, philosophy and the foundation of liberal learning. Anyone who sets himself the topic for the paper that I have must reflect, if indeed he knows the pieces in question, whether anything finer on the subject has been written than Joseph Pieper's two essays, as succinct as they are profound, Muster und Kult and Was heißt Philosophieren. Both were translated into a first English edition and yoked together with Pieper's authorization under the pointed and attributed title, Leisure as the Basis of Culture, with an introduction by none other than T.S. Eliot. So fine are these essays that one wonders whether the audience's time and attention today might not be better served by simply reading from them verbatim for as much as the allotted time allows. I will not do that only because I want to try to get a bit underneath the notes of Pieper's score, so to speak, even as I second much of what he argues for in the essays. The idea of leisure serving as a basis of culture falls easily enough on the educated person's ear. Prosaically, free time is the necessary basis, the precondition of that life we call cultural, devoted to those human interests aimed at something other than the satisfaction of immediate needs and wants. But Pieper, of course, wanted to say a good deal more than that. At the center of these essays is, unsurprisingly, the distinction familiar to the medievals between the servile and the liberal arts, between those organized and for the sake of activities aimed at meeting biological and social needs, versus those beyond useful activities, choice-worthy and pursuable for their own sake. Among these activities, and of particular relevance to the topic at hand, is the pursuit and acquisition of theoretical and practical knowledge. Pieper wished to make more than the familiar claim, though, that there are forms of knowledge-seeking, most evidently forms of theoretical knowledge-seeking, that can be their own justification. He wanted us to dig deeper, to view knowledge in a fully anthropological light, and recognize that even the pursuit of practical knowledge, or knowing how, can and should be grounded in a more fundamental understanding of human nature and man's place in the cosmos. This means that even the so-called servile arts can be pursued in a liberal manner and be appropriately ordered to self-justifying forms of human activity, of which theoretical knowledge acquisition is one. To this end, the essay Muster und Kult contains some insightful remarks about the need for a deproletarianization of the manual laboring classes, and some trenchant criticism of the common understanding of the expressions intellectual worker and intellectual research. But I cannot do justice to those thoughts here. A helpful point of reference in elucidating Pieper's claims in leisure is something like the distinction made by Max Scheler, on at least indirect influence on Pieper, between three types of knowledge. There is, first of all, for Scheler, knowledge for mastery and achievement, Herrschaft oder Leistungswissen. That knowledge germane to the practical and positive sciences, which seeks out, according to our pragmatic and technical interests, what is controllable and manipulable in experienced phenomena, but which eschews any understanding of the essence or nature of those phenomena, and is limited in scope by the receptive powers of our physical organism for certain stimuli. No enemy, but on the contrary, a great admirer of natural and technical scientific knowledge, Scheler held that, and I quote, "No weakly romanticism of the Christian or Indian variety will extinguish the living torch of this science." End of quote. But to this, he also added that the flames of positive science will never be able to give man, I quote again, "that guiding light through life, whose quiet glow alone can feed his torch. Humanitas, and the type of knowledge which it presupposes. Even when positive science should be completed, man as a spiritual being would still be absolutely empty. In fact, he might relapse into a barbarism compared to which all the so-called primitive societies were Hellenes." For barbarism supported systematically by science would be the most dreadful of all conceivable barbarisms. End quote. Scheler then spoke of a second type of knowledge acquisition, Bildungswissen, whose primary aim is the cultivation and full development of the human personality. Here we have the explicit subordination of most types of knowledge, including positive and practical knowledge, to the overall good of the person. The knowledge of the second variety for Scheler serves really, as his commentators tell us, as a transition to a third and highest type of knowledge, a knowledge no less objective than the knowledge of the natural and technical sciences, but where philosophical or absolute knowledge of the essences of things comes into its own. This type 3 knowledge for salvation is the expression Scheler gave it, and it means this salvation in a very specific sense. So knowledge for salvation, according to Scheler, is knowing that liberates us from a tension or original conflict that ties us damagingly and narcissistically to ourselves. Among other things, this is a knowledge that concerns the whole, or the totality, and which leads us to a participation in the source of all being as an irresistible urge of our nature. In his account of what philosophical knowledge is, which comes alive at this level, Scheler speaks of, quote, insight rigorously self-evident in nature, into essences and essential relationships, accessible by way of concrete examples, not to be increased or destroyed by induction, valid a priori for everything contingent, in the order and absolute sequence in which such essences are related to absolute being and its essence. That's end of quote from his On the Eternal in Man. This highest form of knowledge seeking and knowledge acquisition, however, has certain exiguous moral prerequisites. On Scheler's account, knowledge for salvation is driven by a prior love of being, that is, by a desire to participate through knowledge in the essential nature of things other than oneself, including things above oneself. And this requires the rising above the habitual setting of one's immediate concerns, the control of one's natural inclinations, and the humility of the human subject to free him or herself from his or her merely accidental nature. So humility, or accurate self-regard, and self-forgetful other-regarding love are the sine qua non conditions for the kind of knowledge that constitutes knowledge for salvation. The resonances of this for the Dante talk this morning won't be lost on you. I will not attempt to interpret Scheler further here, but note his taxonomy of knowledge because it helps us locate Pieper's standpoint in leisure. No more an enemy of positive and practical scientific inquiry than Scheler, Pieper, of course, holds that any well-ordered society will always be mindful to subordinate practices of knowledge type 1 to those of knowledge type 2, subordinate, that is, knowledge for mastery or achievement, to knowledge for the full development of the person. More interesting, though, is Pieper's own version of something like Scheler's knowledge type 3, knowledge for salvation. So the second of Leisure's essays, Was heißt philosophieren, is translated curiously, but as it happens informatively, as the philosophical act. Emphasis here on the counterintuitive singular substantive act. As far as I know, this was with Pieper's explicit authorization, and I can verify from a visit I made to his home in Münster several decades ago that Pieper spoke a reasonably good English. Anglophonic philosophers are certainly not accustomed to speaking of the, or even a, philosophical act as such, and it is the unpacking of the meaning of this Pieper's term of art that I wish to devote the remainder of this paper, supplying some of the necessary background to the concept which he does not provide in leisure. To begin with, in Was heißt philosophieren, Pieper reprises the theme familiar to the medieval, the medievals with substantive impetus from the ancients, preeminently Plato and Aristotle, but also Heraclitus and Parmenides, that man is by nature capax universi, a being capable of noetic communion with all and anything that is. A being unique among conscious beings on the earth as one whose conscious awareness and life world extends to the whole, and for whom the very concept of the whole, the totality, of all actual or potential being, is a potentially functioning and intelligible one. But for this extraordinary cognitive capability, Pax Universi, to become operative in man, and indeed to order his life in the world, there is a precondition. That human consciousness, which is potentially all things, Aristotle, and which, however localized in a small portion of space, can bring the whole vast expanse of time, space, and purely intelligible, that is logical and mathematical and metaphysical, reality into itself, upon us, must become open to all things. And this opening up to the whole is by no means guaranteed. Enter here, one might think, philosophical eros, the love of wisdom. Philosophy in its original Occidental acceptation. But before philosophy, properly speaking, can commence, there is something prior that must come alive in human consciousness for philosophy itself to be properly launched, properly focalized. And that's something we refer to by the simple English word wonder. Now, while Pieper was by any reckoning a Platonic Aristotelian Thomist, he also thought in an intellectual milieu of the making of Max Scheler, Gabriel Marcel, Martin Heidegger, and Eugen Fink, among others. The partial kinship between these traditions is well known, owing to their like awareness of the intentionality, the essential other-directedness of the human mind. While Pieper's concern in Was heißt Philosophieren is with the role of philosophy as such in the life of leisure and culture, there is little doubt that he would endorse the thoughts on the subject about the prehistory and birth of authentic philosophy that derive from the likes of Scheler, Marcel, and Heidegger, and the tradition, broadly speaking, of existential phenomenology. What does this tradition teach us? That before authentic philosophy can take wing, there must be a primordial wonder which philosophy's task is to thematize, mediate, and systematically unfold. Heidegger famously insisted that whatever is great had to be born great, and that philosophy in its origin and nature was born not of the special and positive sciences, but rather preceded them from above, and was much closer in origin and nature to poetry, a thesis strikingly close to what Pieper argues in Leisure. Why did Heidegger, as others, maintain this? Because before philosophy can begin its dialectical and mediating role in the exploration of the logos of differentiated, self-presenting universal being, it must situate itself and work within the correct horizon. And that horizon, as the horizon which is native to man, must include everything, must leave nothing out and take nothing for granted, on account of an awareness of the essential, if partial, oneness of all the things that are. And this is what primordial wonder delivers us. An awareness of the oneness behind the behind the manyness of anything that is or can be, and can be present to human consciousness. With primordial wonder comes a notion of the whole, the totality, which includes, of course, even as it encompasses human conscious awareness of that totality. What it gives us also is the awareness that truth, as in Hegel's turn of phrase, lies in the whole. It is primordial wonder that awakens us to the ontological mystery. And to paraphrase James Joyce's delightful observation about Catholic ecclesiology, one can say, primordial wonder, oh no, here comes everything. Quoting Aquinas and paraphrasing Aristotle, Pieper endorses the view that the philosopher is like the poet, inasmuch as both are concerned with mirabilia, with things marvelous. And this is because the sole specifying object for the supreme sought-after knowledge, which is wisdom, is nothing less than the whole itself, of which primordial wonder alone makes us initially aware. And philosophy is born so evidently in the example of Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Plato, by thematizing and mediating this wonder. Splitting the difference between Husserl and Heidegger, we can say that the wonder of wonders is that being is, Heidegger, and that it is present to our consciousness, Husserl. Philosophy born of this primordial wonder is a thematic reflection, or bending back on wonder's contents. It is a logically ordered wondering about wonder. An exploration of the logos of that differentiated, self-manifesting, universal being which wonder discloses to us. And philosophy's fundamental question, derivative from this primordial wonder, is the question, as it seeks to understand the beingness of what is, why is there something rather than nothing? You've heard that phrase, I'm sure, before, but you rarely hear the second bit of it. Interesting reasons, I think. So the question, why is there something rather than nothing, when nothing is so much simpler? So philosophy thematizes and queries primordial wonder's totality, considering now the totality as such, and it raises the question of the very ground of being, or that unitary manifold of the things that are and can be. It is in this existential light that philosophy, as the highest form of acquired knowledge, considers the deliverances and knowledge claims of all the special sciences, none of which problematize being, or the beingness of beings as such, but each of which cut away a part of being, a so much and no more, take that part's existence for granted, and explore its nature. Not only then is the philosopher in the business of issuing reminders to the practitioners of the special sciences, Wittgenstein's way of speaking, about their scope and limits, it also follows that no one wonders like the philosopher wonders, that the province of philosophy is preeminently the wondrous, even as poetry and the liberal arts explore, by contemplation and by co-creation, wondrous things. Yet, as Pieper insists in Leisure, philosophy is entirely other-directed, so that it not only begins in, but can only continue by recurrent wonder. A wonder at the metaproblematic, metalogical novelty of being. For universal being can never be deduced, induced, or otherwise inferred from anything else. And wonder at universal being is never a mere discardable trigger to solve some puzzle, a transitory itch to clear up some muddle or intellectual confusion. Those tasks are for the special sciences, including logic, each of which is devoted to understanding and problem solving within the province of what already is and can be. But universal self-manifesting being is not a problem to be solved. It is a realm that we can never set before ourselves and view from without, or put our arms around, or walk away from and return to, or resolve. Being, which constitutes, permeates, and transcends us, belongs instead to the domain of the metaproblematic, in Gabriel Marcel's felicitous expression. It is an overwhelmingly and incomprehensibly clear domain, in this sense of history, that we are capable of exploring from within. Wonder is so the beginning and the end of philosophy, both its birthplace and its promised land, as it befalls philosophy in a non-linear but circular motion, endlessly to explore the part in the light of the whole, and the incomprehensible because exceedingly intelligible whole in light of the partially comprehended parts. Partially comprehended, since thanks to the positive and experimental sciences, even with respect to the parts, we are continually being taught how little we know. Philosophy augments wonder, as can any of the sciences pursued in a philosophical light. Hence Einstein's dictum, only he who is truly wise wonders. But the philosophical act is logically ordered wonder at primordial wonder's deliverance. Now, Pieper, like Scheler, also speaks of the moral prerequisites for authentic philosophy to come to life, but noteworthy in Leisure is his recourse to a moral insight from the Christian theological tradition. Medieval discourse, that is, about the capital or archvice of acedia, a Latin word translated conventionally, but also somewhat misleadingly, as sloth. By acedia, the medievals meant something more than mere crass laziness or indolence, but also something that may wear the mask of indolence's diametric opposite, that is, supreme busyness, ceaseless absorption in work activity, or the ceaseless pursuit of divertissement. Here, as Pieper observes, we have one of the chief enemies of wonder and the contemplative or philosophical life. This kind of acedia is lethal to wonder and the love of wisdom because it represents an aversion to and a flight from that divine goodness, that giftedness of our conscious being that resides in the center of human self-awareness as the primary fact of our existence. Man seeks to identify himself with and allow himself to be absorbed by some limiting function or set of functions typically related to work or shallow amusement. He flees from his place in the whole, as Kalpak's university, and as the self-consciously gifted home of being, the illuminator of being on the earth. And he engages instead in a resentful revolt against the constitution of being, in Eric Voegelin's apt description, which is consonant with Pieper's thoughts here. Pieper would have us contrast this fundamental attitude with that found in religious cult. Here, as the record of social anthropology teaches us, we have the gift of existence, gratefully acknowledged and received, and sacrificially affirmed. In religious worship of the source of man's being, we have an acknowledgement and joyous celebration, in spite of the inevitable vicissitudes and fragmentary nature of human existence, of man's place in the whole. In religious cult, and this is the culmination of the argument in Musik und Kult, the tone is ideally set for the joyous pursuit of the contemplation and co-creation of wondrous things in the undertakings of the liberal arts. The Lord of Being, after all, as Chesterton quipped, does not work, he plays. And the practice of philosophy can work in close tandem with religious cult here, even as religious cult is the apotheosis and doxological consummation of the philosophical life, a point not lost on Plato and his students in the academy, as Pieper reminds us. How is this? In thematizing, reflectively mediating, and valorizing primordial wonder, and man the wanderer, philosophers become the very guardians of wonder, securing wonder at its very foundational source, and giving impetus and maximal room to run for the liberal arts' pursuit of marvels and wondrous things. Of course, since authentic philosophy has no other fuel on which to run than wonder, it too thrives in the climate where the liberal pursuits flourish. So the two should exist in a relation of mutual benefit and enrichment. But it remains that by its very sovereign scope, philosophy is uniquely valuable and uniquely necessary here for what is best described as not the common need, the common good. And it is to Joseph Pieper's great credit that he has resuscitated this important and largely neglected theme in Thomas Aquinas' thought, namely that the existence of the philosophical trade, philosophy engaged in strictly for its own sake, is indispensable for the right ordering of society's resources and activities and for the full development of persons within it. Now, there's one further point in Pieper's analysis worth considering here, and it is an unwelcome one, to put it mildly, for our technocratic age, with the enormous premium it places on control. Simply stated, it is this: that the primordial wonder without which philosophy can neither be launched, nor properly focalized, nor kept alive, is not philosophy's, nor man's generally, for the having. No diligent intellectual training, no set of moral disciplines, no supreme act of the will, no strenuous effort, no centralized state program or five-year plan can bring primordial wonder to us. But we can dispose ourselves to receive it as a gift. Only he who has ears to hear can be summoned by the call of being. Universal being manifests itself only to those who are disposed to receive it. And wonder at this universal being is not, and can never be, the bread of anxious toil, but it is a kind of heavenly manna.